If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Snow covered the ruined Belgian village in uneven layers, gathering on broken brick walls and collapsed roof beams that stuck out like abandoned construction. The winter of 1944 had turned the place into a cold, silent trap. Every window was shattered, every door cracked, every home stripped of anything that could burn for heat. Smoke drifted from distant artillery strikes, spreading through the streets like a thin gray curtain. The American units stationed there had been fighting for days with little rest, and every man felt it in his bones. Corporal Elias Hartmann sat inside what used to be a living room before a shell tore through the ceiling. The roof above him sagged under the snow, and a loose wooden beam creaked whenever the wind pushed against the structure. Elias kept a lantern beside him and worked on his strange, hand-built weapon with slow, steady movements. Springs, screws, a cut-down rifle barrel, tank scrap, and welding marks covered the table like parts stripped from a junkyard. His hands moved with precision, tightening a bolt, checking pressure tension, then wiping grease on a torn cloth. He had a narrow face, dark eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking, and a calmness that made some of the younger soldiers uneasy. He spoke only when necessary. He rarely smiled, and he rarely stopped working. Outside the room, voices echoed. "Look at him," Private Mallory muttered near the doorway. "Fixing that toy again." "It's not a toy," Private Davis replied with a shrug, but even he sounded doubtful. "Whatever it is, it won't stop a Panzer." Elias heard them. He always heard them. The walls had too many holes for privacy. But he didn't react. He kept adjusting the trigger assembly, listening to the small clicks as if they were the only sound in the world. He wasn't here for their approval. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because orders had put his squad on the front line of the German counteroffensive. He was here because the roads behind them were frozen, blocked, and too dangerous to retreat through. And he was here because he had made a quiet promise to himself when he enlisted: do whatever it takes to keep the men around him alive, even if they didn't understand how he operated. The lieutenant, James Porter, walked into the room and looked around with tired eyes. Porter was a man in his early 30s with a heavy jaw, a burned-out cigarette behind his ear, and a constant frown from too many nights awake. He didn't laugh at Elias, but he didn't encourage him either. "You're still working on that thing," Porter said, stepping over chunks of plaster. "Yes, sir," Elias replied, tightening one last bolt. "You sleep at all?" "A few hours." "You'll need more than that." "I'll be fine." Porter studied the weapon, then the soldier holding it. Elias didn't talk about himself often, but Porter had read the file. Raised by a mechanic father in Minnesota, worked in a workshop from the age of 11, lost both parents shortly after the war began. The boy had learned to rebuild engines, repair farm machinery, and make tools from scrap long before he learned to fire a rifle. Porter never knew if that made Elias more valuable or more unpredictable. "Just make sure you can still shoot straight," Porter said quietly. "I can," Elias answered, not lifting his eyes. The lieutenant left him to his work. Outside, the rest of the squad gathered around a fire built from furniture pieces dragged out of a nearby house. Their breath rose into the air like bursts of steam. The cold pressed into their gloves, their boots, their faces. No one talked about victory anymore. They talked about surviving the night or the next hour. They talked about frostbite, lost friends, and the incoming German push that scouts had warned about the day before. Their mission was simple on paper: hold the village and prevent German armor from breaking through the junction that led deeper into Allied territory. If the Germans got past them, nearby units would be surrounded. Supply routes would collapse. The entire front would shift. But simple missions in winter were rarely simple to survive. Elias stepped out to join them, his homemade weapon now strapped to his shoulder with a canvas belt he had stitched together from torn gear. The moment the men saw it, their expressions changed. Private Mallory scoffed. "Look at that thing. Looks like a plumber built a rifle." Davis huffed a laugh. "Might explode in his hands before he even aims it." Elias heard them again, and again said nothing. He simply sat on a broken wall and looked at the snow piling on the rooftops. For a moment, His thoughts drifted back to Minnesota. The smell of engine oil in his father's workshop, the sound of metal clashing, the steady voice explaining how machines fail when you mistreat them and how they work when you listen to them. His father had believed that clear thinking saved lives. And Elias believed it too. Even now, even here, in the cold and the fear. He checked the horizon. No movement yet. But fog was thickening, and distant engine noise sometimes rode in with the wind. He felt pressure growing in his chest, the kind that came before something went wrong. Not panic, just tension. Awareness. Preparation. He didn't want to die here. He didn't want the others to die either, even if they didn't understand him. He tightened his grip on the weapon. If the Germans came with armor, they would have almost nothing to fight back with. Almost nothing, except the device he built with his own hands. The lantern shook slightly from the wind. Snow slid off a nearby roof. The men shifted uncomfortably. Night settled. They waited, and Elias continued to think through every possible scenario, every angle, every weakness in the enemy armor, because he knew what might come with dawn, and he knew he might be the only one prepared to face it. The night deepened around the ruined village, and the cold settled so sharply that every breath felt like pulling ice into the lungs. Men shifted in their makeshift positions, trying to stay awake while leaning against fragments of broken walls. The fire outside the barn had burned down to glowing coals, and the wind pushed snow across the ground in thin layers. Inside the damaged structures, the air smelled of damp wood, burnt plaster, and lingering smoke from artillery that had struck earlier in the evening. Elias checked the streets again, scanning for any movement. Nothing yet. Only fog drifting between the broken houses and the sound of shutters tapping loosely in the wind. He tightened the straps of his gear. His fingers ached from the cold, but his hands remained steady. He had learned long ago to work with numb knuckles during winters in Minnesota when frozen tools were part of daily life. Across the courtyard, Davis and Mallory sat with their backs against a cracked stone wall, rubbing their hands together. They tried to keep quiet, but their unease leaked through every whispered exchange. "You think Command's sending anything to relieve us?" Davis asked, his voice shaky from exhaustion. Mallory shook his head. "Roads frozen and crawling with German patrols. No one's coming through that." Their conversation wasn't meant for Elias, but he caught every word. They were frightened, more than they would admit. The ambush on the anti-tank teams earlier had shaken everyone. If armor pushed through again, this village would fall within minutes. The lieutenant moved around the men, checking their positions, adjusting their spacing, and making sure rifles were loaded. Porter's eyes were sharp even through the fatigue. He understood the reality of their situation better than anyone, but he refused to show uncertainty. The squad needed him steady. The village needed him steady. He approached Elias after making his rounds. "Scouts haven't returned," Porter said. "That's not a good sign." Elias nodded. "They would have been back by now. You think armor's coming?" Elias looked toward the distant tree line where fog had thickened into a solid wall of white. "I think we'll hear engines before we see anything." Porter exhaled slowly, accepting that answer without argument. "Get ready. If something comes through that fog, we'll be cornered." Elias already knew that. He also knew that the improvised round he built earlier, using stolen fragments of munitions and metal panels cut from a wrecked tank, was their only real chance if something heavy appeared. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the cylindrical shape resting inside. It was crude, uneven, and fused together with careful welding. But the explosive compound inside was stable, tested repeatedly in small amounts, calculated under the lantern's light. He didn't know if it would work perfectly, but it was the best option they had. A little past midnight, the distant hum of engines flickered in and out of the wind. Not constant, not loud, but present. Elias heard it before the others. Faint vibrations that moved through the ground like pressure shifting under snow. The lieutenant stiffened. "Movement." "Yes," Elias said simply. "About a kilometer out." The men nearby froze, listening. Mallory swallowed hard. Davis gripped his rifle tighter. Even the wind seemed to slow, letting the low mechanical rumble carry clearly. Porter signaled the squad with a sharp hand motion. "Positions. Move." The men scattered to predetermined spots inside the half-collapsed barn that overlooked the eastern road. Its walls had wide gaps where shells had punched through earlier, giving them a clear view of approaching threats. The barn smelled of wet hay, burnt wood, and cold earth. Their boots left prints on the dusty floor as they took cover behind broken beams and shattered farm equipment. Elias followed without hesitation. He took a spot near a broken wooden pillar, propping his homemade weapon against the edge of a tilted support beam. The fog outside glowed faintly in the lantern light, making the world beyond look like a blank white screen waiting for something to emerge. Inside, every man steadied his breath. Davis clenched the strap of his helmet. Mallory wiped sweat from his forehead despite the freezing air. Even Porter stood perfectly still, listening for the pattern of tank treads he hoped never to hear again. Elias kept his eyes forward. His pulse was slow but firm. He felt tension settle into his shoulders, not panic but readiness. Every calculation he had made earlier replayed in his mind. Range, trajectory, blast pressure, the vulnerable points of German armor. He traced the possibilities silently, grounding himself in the technical focus that had always kept him steady when emotion tried to take over. Then the sound became unmistakable. A heavy engine idled in the fog, moving with a slow, deliberate grind. Snow vibrated on the wooden planks beneath them. Porter whispered, "That's a Panzer." Nobody responded. There was nothing to say. A silhouette formed through the white haze, broad, tall, armored. The machine grew clearer with each second, its turret rotating slightly as it advanced toward the village center. The soldiers inside the barn locked into place, feeling the cold press harder against their backs. Elias steadied his breathing, resting his hand on the weapon he had built with quiet desperation and relentless focus. This was the moment he had prepared for while the others doubted him. This was the moment he had expected from the moment scouts failed to return. And as the shadows of German infantry began to appear behind the tank, the barn fell into a silence so complete that the ticking lantern sounded louder than distant shells. Elias tightened his grip. The fog parted. The Panzer moved into full view. The night had ended. Dawn would bring the real fight. The Panzer's outline sharpened as the fog thinned, its steel plates reflecting the dull gray of the early morning. Snow shifted under the weight of the tank as it rolled forward, each movement producing a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the barn's weakened frame. The German infantry behind it advanced with rifles raised, moving in tight formation and scanning the ruins with steady, practiced caution. Their boots cut clear lines in the frost-covered ground. Inside the barn, every man held his breath. The temperature felt colder, as if the presence of the tank pulled warmth out of the air. Davis pressed his back against a broken support beam, trying not to tremble. Mallory's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth clicked. Several men had never faced armor at such close range. Their eyes were wide, their grips unsteady, their confidence draining with every step the Panzer took. Elias adjusted his posture, bringing his weapon to his shoulder with controlled precision. His expression didn't change, but inside his thoughts moved fast. He evaluated the distance, noted the angle of the turret, and measured how much time he would have before the cannon turned fully toward the barn. He felt pressure in his chest, but it didn't interfere with his decision-making. Fear had weight, but he refused to let it dictate anything. The lieutenant crouched beside a broken wooden cart, whispering a final order. "Hold fire until it's close. If we shoot too early, we're done." The Panzer crept forward, treads grinding against stone and frozen earth. Its turret shifted, aligning toward the cluster of destroyed houses where the Americans had taken cover the day before. Smoke from distant burning debris drifted through the air, spreading in thin streaks across the tank's armor. Elias knew that if the turret locked onto the barn, they wouldn't survive the blast. The structure was already unstable. A single shell would collapse the entire frame and bury everyone inside. The tank paused. Its engine remained running, low and heavy. Then the turret started to rotate toward them. The lieutenant's voice cracked in a whisper. "Not yet." Snowflakes drifted through the broken boards above as the massive barrel swung inch by inch toward their position. The soldiers around Elias shifted slightly, preparing for the impact they believed was seconds away. One man made the mistake of whispering a prayer too loudly, and Porter shot him a warning glare. The Panzer steadied, its cannon aimed directly at the barn. Porter sucked in a sharp breath. Now, he never finished the order. Elias stepped forward on his own. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't hesitate. He felt every calculation he had made the night before aligned perfectly with the reality in front of him. He aimed for the exposed ventilation grill on the upper rear panel, the weakest area accessible from his angle. He knew German armor. He knew the airflow points. And he knew his round, crude as it was, could punch through if it hit exactly right. He inhaled slowly. His finger tightened on the trigger. His heart pounded once hard. Then he fired. The shot burst from the weapon with a sharp metallic crack, louder than anything inside the barn. Sparks jumped from the improvised chamber, and the recoil pushed into Elias's shoulder. The round cut through the cold air in a straight, unwavering path. It struck the grill. The impact produced a dull thud, followed by a short metallic rattle. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the tank jolted violently. A muffled blast erupted inside the armored hull, bursting through seams and forcing dark smoke out from vents and panel gaps. The Panzer's engine coughed loudly and died, its treads locking in place. The turret froze mid-rotation. Flames flickered behind the damaged rear panel, burning through exposed wiring and igniting fuel residue. German infantry shouted orders, scrambling backward as the tank's interior caught fire. One soldier yelled for support while another tried to approach the vehicle, only to be forced back by the heat pouring through the ruptured grill. Inside the barn, the Americans stared in total disbelief. Davis lowered his rifle slowly, eyes fixed on the smoking tank. Mallory's mouth hung open, unable to form a single word. The lieutenant stood motionless, one hand still raised in the half gesture of an unfinished command. The Panzer burned steadily, black smoke rising into the pale morning sky. Elias didn't celebrate. He didn't turn for recognition. He simply lowered his weapon and stepped back behind cover, breathing out in a controlled, almost quiet release. Porter moved to his side, his voice low and steady. "That shot, how did you?" Elias shook his head slightly, keeping his eyes on the battlefield. Later, they're regrouping. German infantry adjusted positions, shaken by the sudden loss of their armored support. Some pulled back. Others fired sporadic rounds toward the barn, not knowing what had hit the tank. Their formation fractured with hesitation as they reassessed whether the Americans had hidden heavy weapons. The lieutenant seized the moment. "Hold positions. If they push again, we break them here." The Americans steadied. The fear that had threatened to crush them only minutes earlier now felt different. Lighter, pushed aside by raw adrenaline and the shock of realizing they were still alive. Elias reloaded his improvised weapon with practiced calm, even though he had only one explosive round prepared. He scanned the field again, searching for any threats still advancing. The burning tank continued to hiss and crack. Snow fell around it in soft layers, melting instantly when it touched the flames. The enemy formation hesitated one final time. Then they retreated into the fog. The village grew quiet again, except for the distant rumble of artillery and the burning metal of the destroyed Panzer. Inside the barn, the men finally breathed. Not one of them knew what to say to Elias, and he didn't expect anything from them. He only checked the weapon in his hands, making sure it hadn't been damaged by the recoil. His father had taught him that tools saved lives when used with clarity and purpose. Today had proven it true again. The squad stood in silence, realizing that survival had come from a place they never trusted, until now. Smoke from the burning Panzer drifted into the gray morning sky, spreading in slow ribbons over the shattered rooftops. The German infantry had fully withdrawn, leaving behind boot tracks cut deep into the snow and the distant echo of hurried commands disappearing into the trees. The sudden quiet felt unreal, as if the village itself hesitated to accept the fact that the fighting had stopped. The Americans stayed in position for several minutes, rifles aimed at the fog until they were certain no second wave was coming. When the lieutenant finally gave the signal to move, the men stepped cautiously out of the barn, blinking against the cold wind and the sharp smell of burning fuel. Their boots crushed frozen debris, bits of charred wood, and scattered shell fragments. The ruined tank sat at an angle where its treads had locked, flames still flickering inside the damaged ventilation grill. The metal popped and hissed as it cooled, sending small sparks into the air. Some soldiers kept a safe distance, unwilling to approach something that had nearly killed them moments ago. Elias walked toward it with steady steps. His breath rose in front of him, slow and controlled. The weapon hung from his shoulder, still carrying traces of the recoil that had pushed against his arm. He stopped a few paces from the tank, watching the fire die down behind the warped metal. He didn't look proud. He didn't look shaken. He simply observed the result, assessing the shot, measuring what had worked and what could have failed. Porter approached him first. "What you did?" The lieutenant paused, searching for words that didn't sound dramatic or forced. "It changed everything out here." Elias nodded once. The angle was right. The grill was exposed. "I had a clear shot." "That's not what I meant." Porter lowered his voice, careful to keep the conversation private. "Everyone assumed we were done. You didn't." Elias didn't respond immediately. He looked at the cracked road leading into the forest, then at the houses with collapsed walls. "There wasn't another option," he said. "If that tank fired, none of us would be standing here." Porter watched him closely, trying to understand the man beyond the quiet focus and the improvised weapon. "You planned this for days, didn't you?" "It wasn't planning," Elias answered. "It was preparation." Behind them, the squad gathered slowly around the ruined tank. Their expressions were a mix of disbelief, relief, and something else, something new. Mallory approached with hesitant steps, chewing the inside of his cheek before speaking. "Hey, Elias," he said, the name sounding awkward in his mouth. "That shot was something." Elias turned his head slightly. "You're all right." Mallory blinked, not expecting the question. "Yeah, just trying to process it." Davis stepped forward, rubbing his glove over his face. "How did you even know where to hit it?" Elias studied the burning tank again, letting the memories surface with a clarity that felt both familiar and heavy. "My father worked on engines. Cars, tractors, anything that used pressure systems. He taught me to find weak points, places where airflow or heat needed space. Machines follow patterns, even armored ones." Mallory crossed his arms, shoulders dropping. "Didn't know that about you." Elias didn't blame them. He rarely talked about himself. There wasn't much to say, and even less worth sharing during war. But the lieutenant sensed the men needed more, something that explained the quiet resilience they had misunderstood for so long. "He lost his father early in the war," Porter said quietly. "Mechanic. Good one." The squad listened without interrupting. The wind pressed through the broken village, stirring loose bits of snow. Elias kept his eyes on the tank. "When I enlisted, I figured if I could use what he taught me to keep people alive, I should, even if it meant trying things that didn't make sense to anyone else." Davis shifted his stance. "You didn't have to do it alone, you know." Elias looked at him, not with irritation, but with a quiet honesty that made Davis swallow his next sentence. "People handle fear differently," Elias said. "This was the way I kept mine steady." Porter nodded slowly. "Well, you kept all of us steady today." The men fell silent again, this time with respect instead of tension. They looked at Elias differently, not as the odd soldier with a strange invention, but as the reason the squad was still breathing. The mocking comments and skepticism they had carried for days felt small and embarrassing in the cold morning air. A faint clatter echoed from the northern ridge, distant gunfire far from the village. The lieutenant raised his head, assessing the sound. "Reinforcements are pushing through the sector," Porter said. "They'll reach us soon. We'll be able to move out." The squad visibly relaxed. Reinforcements meant safety. It meant the worst had passed. Porter placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Keep that weapon close. We're reporting what happened to command. They'll want to know how you built it." Elias nodded, but the idea of explaining it to officers or engineers didn't excite him. He wasn't searching for recognition. He only cared that the men had made it through the morning. The flames inside the Panzer dimmed until only smoke remained. Snow began to fall again, blanketing the road, the ruins, and the charred edges of the tank. For the first time in days, the village felt still. Not safe, but still. And for now, that was enough. The squad gathered near the barn, preparing to regroup as the sky brightened with the pale light of a cloud-covered morning. Elias stayed back one moment longer, staring at the tank that had almost ended everything. He felt tired, but not overwhelmed. He felt the cold, but not the fear that usually accompanied it. He felt steady. For the first time, the men around him saw that steadiness for what it truly was. Reinforcements arrived shortly after noon, their trucks rolling carefully over frozen rubble and snow-packed streets. The engines echoed between the ruined houses, breaking the long silence that had hung over the village. Fresh soldiers stepped down, wrapped in thicker coats and carrying crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and field rations. Their presence alone steadied the men who had survived the morning. Relief settled into the squad's bodies like a slow wave. Shoulders loosened, breathing deepened, and the tension in their faces eased for the first time in days. Lieutenant Porter spoke briefly with the arriving officers, pointing to the destroyed Panzer still smoking at the edge of the street. The officers walked around it, examining the ruptured ventilation grill and the blast damage inside the hull. They exchanged quiet remarks, clearly puzzled by the weapon that had done the job. Before long, they signaled Porter aside for explanations. The squad gathered near a broken stone fence, accepting hand warmers, cigarettes, and small cans of soup from the reinforcement unit. Davis took a seat on the snow-covered ground, leaning his back against the fence as steam from his can rose into the air. Mallory sat beside him, rubbing warmth into his hands and glancing occasionally at Elias. Elias remained standing at the edge of the group, adjusting the leather strap of his weapon. The barrel still held faint traces of smoke from a morning shot. Reinforcement soldiers walked past him with curious glances, unsure what to make of the quiet man, carrying a device that didn't match any regulation design. After finishing with the officers, Porter approached Elias with a focused, steady expression. "They want you to meet with the engineers at the staging area up the road," Porter said. "Not now. Later, when we pull out. They want a full breakdown of how you built it." Elias nodded. "I'll explain everything they need." "They're not questioning you," Porter added, noticing his expression. "They're impressed. What you created wasn't luck." Elias lowered his gaze for a moment, processing that. Recognition had never been a goal, but the idea that the design could help other units struck him as meaningful. He thought of the frozen nights spent working over the lantern, the frustration of broken springs, the calculations scratched on scrap paper, and the quiet promise he had made to himself before joining the army. If this could prevent another squad from facing armor with nothing but rifles, then the effort had value beyond today. When the lieutenant walked away to manage logistics, the rest of the squad hesitated before approaching. Mallory stepped forward first, his voice steady but unsure. "You saved us," he said. "All of us. I know we gave you a hard time. More than you deserved." Elias shrugged lightly. "You were scared. Everyone was." "That doesn't excuse it," Davis added as he walked up beside Mallory. "We should have trusted you sooner, or at least asked what you were doing instead of assuming things." Elias took a slow breath. "It doesn't matter now. We're still here." Mallory rubbed the back of his neck. "Do you ever get scared?" "You never show it." Elias looked at the burned tank, its metal cooled into a matte black shell. "Of course I do. I just don't let fear make the decisions." The honesty in his voice settled the last of the tension between them. For the first time, the men understood him as more than the quiet soldier in the corner of the room. They saw the weight he carried, the discipline behind his silence, and the steady focus that had kept them alive. Snow continued to fall as reinforcements prepared the convoy. The squad gathered around a small stove one of the engineers set up, warming their hands while waiting for orders to move. The warmth spread slowly through Elias's gloves and into his palms. He didn't speak much, but the men didn't leave him on the edge of the circle this time. They made space without thinking, a natural adjustment to the bond that had finally settled between them. When the convoy was ready, Porter gave the signal to load up. The men climbed onto the back of a truck, settling against bundled canvas and crates of food. Elias sat with them, the improvised weapon resting across his knees. No one mocked it now. No one avoided looking at it. Instead, the squad regarded it the same way they looked at their rifles, an essential tool in a place where survival depended on what you could hold in your hands. As the trucks rolled out of the village, Elias looked back one last time at the burned Panzer and the shattered buildings they had defended. The destroyed tank stood as proof of the danger they had faced and the narrow margin by which they had survived. It also marked a quiet turning point, one earned not through orders or speeches, but through action when it mattered. The convoy continued down the snow-covered road towards safer ground. The sky remained overcast, but the air felt different, less oppressive, less heavy. The men spoke quietly among themselves, discussing the next checkpoint, potential rest, and the hot meals they hoped to receive at the staging area. As the truck rumbled forward, Mallory nudged Elias with a small, genuine grin. "When this war ends, you should teach me some of those mechanical tricks your father taught you." Elias looked at him, then nodded. "If you want to learn, I'll teach you." Mallory's grin widened, and Davis chuckled under his breath. The road stretched ahead, lined with frost-covered trees and drifting snow. The war wasn't over, but the squad moved forward with renewed confidence because they knew they could rely on one another, even under the worst conditions. Elias leaned back against the truck's sideboard, feeling the engine vibrate beneath him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of ease. The fear was still there, but it no longer pressed on his chest. The memory of the morning, the danger, the silence, the narrow escape, had settled into clarity. He had done what he needed to do. His father would have understood, and the men beside him finally did too. As the convoy disappeared into the forest road, the chapter closed with certainty, not doubt. No questions remained. They had survived. They were together. And for now, that was the closest thing to peace the war could offer.